Okay, welcome everybody. We'll just let in a few more latecomers. Today is the second in the series of talking Chinese Australia. And we're very pleased to be able to welcome Major General Professor Darrell Loh Choi. He's one of those energetic people with a large list of letters after their name. But for our purposes, I just want to stress that he is a fully qualified engineer, town planner, and rose to the rank of Major General in the Australian Army. Darrell has used these qualifications and skills to research climate change and the environment, among other things, and his high standing in these areas has been recognised in professorial appointments at Griffith University and with the Chinese Academy of Sciences. And despite what must have been a very busy time in acquiring these skills and expertise, Darrell has, fortunately for us, also been passionately involved in researching his own family history, researching and presenting over the last 3 decades, in fact. Darrell's own family background being as interesting and diverse as his own life. And just like an episode from Who Do You Think You Are, Darrell, the military man, has discovered, quite by chance within his own family background, another military man in some Kum Tiy before he decided to take up becoming a merchant in Australia. The Chinese Australian History Society, therefore, is very pleased to be able to welcome Darrell Loh Choi to this special History Week theme of talking Chinese Australian history, themed history, what is it good for? And Darrell will be using his own family history to demonstrate to us the value of history. And therefore, I wish to welcome all our listeners and a special welcome to Darrell. Darrell, welcome.
Thank you, Michael, and thanks for the opportunity to make this presentation. I'll just share the screen now. There we are. Okay. Is that okay, Michael?
That's fine. Good.
That's fine. Okay, good.
I'll be muting myself now. So there you go. Go for it.
Thank you. So I was invited to make this presentation probably the end of last year now, well before the COVID-19 kicked in, and I was to be making this in person down in Sydney. So we'll make do with this Zoom presentation, and I trust that I can present the information that I wanted to do in person. So before I do, I just want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country where each and every one of us are located today. In that respect, I want to acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging, and the traditional owners in particular of the land and seascapes, which are the subject of our considerations today. So as Michael's already said, the theme for New South Wales History Week is history. What is it good for? And I wanted to approach that question through the lens of my family history research. Now, I'm not being a professional historian. I've approached this purely from an amateur basis, although whatever publications I want to put out there, I'm endeavouring to get them peer reviewed. So just a little bit on the background to my family history research in terms of where it's been focused in the past. I was born and bred in far north Queensland, Innisfail, spent my time on a cane farm of Vinda and in Innisfail. And my family really is focused around the Palmer River goldfields and then later on cane farming down the Cairns, Vinda corridor. So that's the focus. And then more recently, the focus has broadened out into North Queensland, picking up places like Mareeba, Atherton, Georgetown, Milchester and Bowen. And the themes that I've been researching in terms of commerce, it's been my ancestors as merchants, shopkeepers, and in the fishing industry in far north Queensland, agriculture, obviously sugarcane farming, maize growing and market gardeners, and then mining associations supporting the mining, gold mining industry, the copper mining industry, and tin mining. And the years of my focus are shown there in the far right-hand column. But the observation that I want to make here is that through my 4 ancestral lines, there are no gold miners. And I think that's the first myth that I want to debunk, that the Chinese were largely gold miners in Australia. So my current journey and family history inquiries are based in southern China in the 1860s in terms of my ancestral villages on my paternal side, around the area, I suppose, north of Macau to Guangzhou, Canton, and then more recently, in terms of my military ancestors' connections, the area around Shanghai. And then that's taken me into areas also outside of North Queensland, into New South Wales and Victoria, as I'll explain in a second, and then to New Zealand, and now to Fiji. So I want to use as a case study for this presentation my great-great-grandfather, Kum Tiy. I started to research him when I realised that it was a family connection, and found that he was instrumental with a number of other prominent Chinese merchants of the day in a lot of activity in the latter half of the 1800s in New South Wales in particular. I mean, everyone and I had heard of Kum Tiy, you know, even though I'm not a student of history, but the exploits of Kum Tiy are well known, largely because, you know, I suppose he published, or his wife published his biography. But when I started to look at some of these documents, it's obvious that Kum Tiy was standing right beside him. So here are the 6 signatories that signed this petition back in the 1880s on behalf of and with the approval of the Chinese residents of South Australia, Victoria, New South Wales, Queensland. Something's going wrong here. Sorry, and Tasmania. So I suppose just like the current National Cabinet, Western Australia stood apart from all that. Then I started to do some further research, and I mean, the obvious one that I went to first was Shirley Fitzgerald's book, Red Tapes and Golden Scissors. And I couldn't figure out why Kum Tiy was not mentioned at all in that book, although some of the primary sources were used. So looking further afield then, at the exploits of Kum Tiy and the activities he was involved in, this is not a photograph of Kum Tiy, I'm just using it to illustrate the point. He was standing right beside Kum Tiy in all those major activities. And that was reported in the newspapers of the day, including the Bulletin, in government gazettes, it was referenced, and in other documents, particularly those held by the Sydney City Council, such as the Sand Directories of Sydney and so on. So the personal connection is here. It's up my paternal line. The link back to Kum Tiy as one of my great-great-grandfathers. So establishing the business, he established his Sydney business within months of arriving in Australia, and even though I haven't pinpointed that exactly at this stage, it was somewhere in the late 1864 to early 1865. It was reported that it cost him and his other 3 partners, one was in New South Wales, the other 2 were in China, £37,000 to establish that merchant business at the Rocks in Sydney. And in today's currency, that's about $4.5 million. He was one of the few bilingual merchants in the colony at that time, and he also wrote in cursive script, as you can see from the Mitchell Library archives. I managed to secure a petition that he signed, and there's his signature. So the question that remains for me was, well, where did he acquire his money, and how did he learn to read and write English? I mean, that was a $64,000 question for me. Now, the clue to those answers came from a bulletin article in the personal items that said, Some Kum Tiy, sorry, I'll just get it up there. Some Kum Tiy, the Sydney Chinese merchant, was a non-commissioned officer under Chinese Gordon. Well, as a military person, I knew full well who Chinese Gordon was. And the fact that he was a non-commissioned officer said that we're dealing with a military force that the English had something to do with. They didn't establish it, but it was along the lines of the colonial army that the British established in India, where the officers were English or Europeans, and the indigenous folk were the non-commissioned officers and soldiers. So straight away, it gave me some ideas. So I then had to work out how this event came about. Just to mention about Chinese Gordon, when I did a bit more research, it confirmed that he commanded an organisation called the Ever Victorious Army, which existed from 1862 to 1864. So with those dates, it situated the event that was going on in China for me. But just a bit about Gordon, because this is important to understand the way in which he commanded this force. He was born into a military and very religious family in 1833. So he saw service in the Crimea, and he had experience from that. He was a deeply religious man, and that shaped and influenced his whole life. And I might add that he was a Royal Engineer, which was important to me because I'm also a Royal Australian Engineer. So history records Gordon. Oh, sorry, this thing's playing up on me. So history records him by the names not only of Chinese Gordon, but of Gordon Pasha and Gordon of Khartoum. And that's where he met his eventual death as the Governor General of Khartoum, fighting the Mahdi. So as I said, the Ever Victorious Army situated this within the Taiping Rebellion. And of course, that lasted from 1850 to 1864. There it is there. And the Ever Victorious Army existed for 4 years at the end of the Taiping Rebellion. So the Taiping Rebellion, interesting occurrence in China, Chinese history. It was considered the most destructive war of the 19th century. It claimed the lives of somewhere, and this is really just a wild guess that is recorded in history, of somewhere between 20 and 25 million people. I mean, that's unimaginable by today's standards. Some publications even claim 30 million people. 15-year-long conflict involved some 10 million troops, and as many as 600 cities changed hands many times. And it witnessed the reduction of some district populations from 40 to 80%. So it was quite disastrous on the whole Chinese population. Now, the Qing dynasty and their imperial army were ineffectual. They couldn't control the Taiping Rebellion, and they kept losing successive battles until 1859, and the Qing rebels were on the outskirts of Shanghai. Now, Shanghai was the jewel in the crown to the British imperial and European powers. It was a port, one of the ports that was succeeded under the Opium Wars, and it was where they'd set up their merchant business and banking. So the wealthy guilds of Shanghai's tea and silk merchants, plus the bankers, didn't want to see the city fall into the hands of the rebels, so they put up the money to establish their own military force. And the ads call for, as I got there, the quote, men knowledgeable about the military. So that was in 1859, and that cause was taken up by an American called Ward. And I won't go into his details here, it doesn't fit this presentation. But so it was an American filibuster who'd seen service in the Mexican army, in the Crimean, working in the French army in the Crimea, and in other conflicts around the world. So he brought that knowledge into China and established the ever victorious army. He was killed in action in 1862. And that's where the British saw a chance to step in and gain control over this force. And they recommended to the governor of the province for the Qing dynasty that a British officer be appointed to command it. And eventually that turned out to be Gordon. Even though he was only a captain in the engineers at that stage, he was made a brevet major and eventually a lieutenant colonel. But he commanded this force. And as you can see there, there's some real live images of that force. The camera was just becoming available at that stage, so we're lucky we've got these images of it. Now, the interesting thing about the ever victorious army that I think is relevant, it was active for only 4 years. It varied in strength between 3,000 and 5,000 men. In Australian Army terms, that's about a brigade. It was instrumental in the defeat of the Taiping Rebellion. It was the first Chinese force led by Western officers, and it was the first to be trained in the use of modern Western weapons, techniques, tactics, and strategies. Now, why did that come about? Well, the arms dealers had nowhere to sell all their arms. The Crimean War had just finished, and there were no battles going on. So there were lots of modern weapons of that time available to equip this force, including artillery, which you saw in the previous imagery, which is most unusual to train indigenous forces with artillery. But this force was so trained. And it was trained in British military tactics. It became a model for later Chinese armies. And importantly, soldiers responded to English commands and bugle call. So they had to learn English to be able to understand the orders they were being given and to undertake the tactics. And they were dressed, as you can see there, in semi-Western uniform. Interestingly, they were paid monthly in Mexican dollars, which was the international currency of that time. Now, I'm just going to give you a couple of quotes here to sort of sum up Gordon and the way he approached his command. And the first is, in 15 months, he had accomplished a tremendous task. He recaptured all the great strongholds, broken up the rebellion, changed the invading army into a cloud of runaways, sulking away in the mountains and the woods. He had saved millions of money, millions of men and women from famine, torture and death. He had saved a mighty empire and a throne. He had written his name across the map of China. And that came from a publication in 1891 by Hake. So this ever victorious army was technically part of the Imperial Army, although it operated completely independent. And Gordon was almost given a free hand, almost. But I won't go into those sort of details today. But it's important to note that the final suppression of the Taipings occurred on the 28th of April, 1864, without the ever victorious army participation. They'd turned the tables on the rebels, but they weren't allowed to participate in the final attack on the strongholds, particularly Nanjing. It was given to the Imperial Army. and those of you who understand Chinese culture will know the reason why they were saving face there. So when the rebels were defeated entirely, Gordon was about to leave and go back for another assignment to England, but he said it was really the wrong thing to leave a well-trained, well-armed force such as the victorious army in existence, because under the wrong leadership, it could be turned against the imperial authorities, and even it could constitute a third party in this war-torn country. So he recommended that it be disbanded and the soldiers sent back to their respective counties or villages. So that's what happened. It was disbanded on the 1st of June, 1864. The provincial administration paid a gratuity to the officers and men upon their discharge. It was a significant gratuity, and they received an extra month's pay and travel costs back to their respective homes. And this point is important in terms of Kum Tiy, I think. The wounded soldiers receive additional monies depending on the nature of their wounds. So that's clearly where Kum Tiy would have accumulated his finances from, and I'm assuming he was an NCO, we know that, so he must have been there for at least the whole 4 years to reach NCO rank, and he had the opportunity to accumulate a lot of money, because the other money that they were paid, that before they put in an attack to retake a city, the commander of the force would sit down and negotiate, because Gordon didn't want the force pillaging and sacking the retaken cities, as was the custom right throughout the world in those days, being a religious man. So he insisted that they get paid well. He insisted that they be given a bonus for every city they recaptured. So they'd renegotiate that. And most of the cities recaptured, the bonus was somewhere between 20 and 30,000 pounds. So there was quite a lot of money, coming from the Shanghai merchants and bankers to pay off this force. So clearly, that's where an NCO could accumulate a lot of money. So the merchant. The first evidence of Kum Tiy in Australia comes from the Sydney Mail, and he's importing from Melbourne, and as you can see there, on the 21st of May, 1865. That's the earliest I've discovered to date, but in the same year, he exports 1,000 sovereigns on the Madras to Point de Galle, and I'll come back to that later. So we know from all these records in the papers and the customs records that he's got economic activity, merchant activity going on in the early months of 1865. In the Sands Sydney Directory, the firms listed they first set up in 199 George Street in 1866. So these directories are prepared the year before. So he would have been there in 1865. And as you can see from that map of Sydney, he's later moved to his permanent headquarters in 225 Lower George Street. There's a map of that part of George Street, and as you can see there, there's a reference to his shop. Now, this later became the store of Onyek Lee. You can see the number there, 225, after Kum Tiy left Australia. There's a connection between Kum Tiy and Lee, and they would have slipped into his establishment once Kum Tiy was vacated. And those of you who know the history of the Rocks, the buildings with odd numbers in Lower George Street were the respectable ones. The ones with the odd numbers, the even numbers on the opposite side was the focus of the Royal Commission in 1891-92. That's an interesting way in which the city was laid out in those days. Okay, this is just a couple of images of Lower George Street around the time Kum Tiy would have been there, and it was located in proximity to Circular Quay, which was the main shipping point at that time. So it served the purpose that they should set up their main establishment close to the ships coming in, bringing in their imports and taking out their exports. I just want to mention this incident because it's fairly important to Kum Tiy. In 1881, there was a smallpox outbreak, and it broke out in the store next door to Kum Tiy, 223, which was Onchong. Well, that's how it was reported in the newspapers, that his son contracted it and therefore spread it into Sydney. But subsequent medical research shown that was probably not true. But anyway, the Chinese got blamed for it. The city council imposed a quarantine. Kum Tiy was included in that. So all the people that lived above his store that worked for him were placed into quarantine for a couple of months. He was prevented from trading for 2 to 3 months. So he lost a lot of business. The Chinese were demonized throughout the colony for this smallpox outbreak. And, there was a lot of financial loss, as I said, incurred as a result of not being allowed to trade for a couple of months. Some of the commodities that the researchers highlighted, I'm using the period 1865 to 1895, and this is merely a selected sample of some of his imports, showing where they were coming from. I'm not going to read those out, you can quickly see through that, but you can see that he was well and truly into the beach demur activities, bringing it from Fiji, and that was highly prized, obviously, in China. So that was being exported through Sydney back to China. And he's bringing in shrimps from Honolulu and a whole range of other Chinese goods, which are obviously supplying the local Chinese market. In terms of exports, I'm just using the period 1865 to 73 here. The biggest commodity in terms of frequency of item is sovereigns going to Point de Galle. And I'll explain that in a second for those of you who haven't, you haven't heard about this sort of practice. And then back to Hong Kong and to China, there was a lot of scrap metal. And even, I found it interesting, horseshoes. But to a non-industrialized country as China was then, it makes sense that they were moving this scrap iron from westernized countries back to China. Okay. So there's clear evidence that Kum Tiy was acting as a clan bank or a district bank. And again, from some of the newspapers, he was the agent for this clipper ship, which sailed between Hong Kong and Sydney. It was a direct line. So that was for freight and passengers, and also to the islands. So there's one to Fiji, the schooner Dauntless, which they were using, and that was bringing people and goods, but mainly goods. So in terms of his international networks, what I've mapped out here, obviously there was a connection between Sydney and China, mainly, Canton, I would imagine, and Hong Kong for certain. Point de Galle, which was in Ceylon, as it was then called, Sri Lanka now. And that was a significant point in trade because you could get to the Suez Canal to Europe from there, and you could also transship back to Hong Kong. So a lot of the stuff was going from Sydney to Melbourne to Point de Galle and then back to Hong Kong. He was obviously trading in Britain and in Europe, trading in New Zealand, Fiji, Honolulu, and San Francisco. So there's the reach of his international trading network in the second half of the 1800s. In terms of branch stores, we know from a number of newspaper articles and other documents, government gazettes and so on, he at one stage had 13, or he was a partner in 13 branch stores in New South Wales, 15 in Victoria, 2 in Queensland, or I suspect that was more, but some haven't come to light yet, 9 in New Zealand, and he had 1 in Fiji, as well as a trading vessel over there. In terms of New South Wales, these are the ones I've been able to confirm to date. And the interesting one there is Sam Tong Lee, interesting Sydney branch store, and it was it gets a mention in Henry Lawson's book, or well, piece of work called The Ghost of Many Christmas. As a child, Henry Lawson recalls going into that store and smelling the confectionery and so on. There's the 2 confirmed stores in Queensland, and the one in Victoria is in Bridge Street, Bendigo, and he was in partner with Lo Kwong Wing, or Sam Kum Lee, which was Lo Kwong Wing's store in Melbourne. So they're the confirmed ones. They're still work in progress. The other still to be confirmed, but I think I've probably got these right. In Victoria, there's the stores to date where I've got some evidence of a link between Sam Kum Tiy and Sydney to those stores, largely through Lo Kwong Ming and his activities, but not always. And then in New South Wales, since my original research, there are the locations of those stores. I might add, I only found out about Sam Kum Tiy 2 years ago, so I've had to do a lot of research in my spare time. But they're unconfirmed at this stage, and they're not in any publication. Just to give you an idea of the nature of the branch stores, which I found fascinating, I've used a case study of Sam Kum Hang, which was their store in Young. They set this up not long after the Lambing Flat incident. They paid £34,000 for this store, residence for the manager, and a small warehouse, and I suppose they would have had stables and so on. But here's an ad, and interestingly, it says there that the goods here were purchased especially for this establishment by Mr. Sam Kum Tiy from the leading firms of Sydney and Melbourne. But interestingly, this store and many of the branch stores that he had supports the work by earlier researchers that these Chinese stores in country, regional, New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, did not exclusively cater for the local Chinese community. They catered for the whole community. And in this case, because Young became a very important agricultural area, particularly after gold mining waned, they supported the agriculture and pastoral industries, not just the mining industry. They were well integrated into these local communities, and they often owned the land and the building in fee simple. And in this case, here they were building architecturally designed, purpose-built facilities. They were using the top architects in Sydney to design their buildings. I've done a little bit of work in New Zealand, and the main store there that I'm probably 80% convinced some Kum Tiy was associated with, is Kwong Sing Wing, which was in Stafford Street, Dunedin, and then working out the other 9 stores, still work in progress, but that's where they were, and almost 95% of those are in the gold mining districts of the South Island of New Zealand, although, you know, Raglan up the top there is in the North Island. So in terms of social activity, there's a bucket load of newspaper articles reporting some Kum Tiy hosting major Chinese celebrations, such as Chinese New Year, being one of the main 2 focal points of those activities in Sydney. Also, he hosted major events where the Chinese merchants were trying to strategize and draw up their representation to the colonial government. They hosted both Chinese and European functions at their establishments in Lower George Street. My evidence suggests that he was a Zhongshan person and belonged to these 2 native place societies. There's great connections between the people that worked for him, the managers that he had that are known Zhongshan people, and some Kum Tiy. And there's just a lot of evidence also that he was part of the Kwong Yi Tong, which was really a merchant, it became a merchant controlled organisation as opposed to being a place-based one. And we also know that his firm was part of the Ling Ying Tong, which Lee set up in 1902, even though some Kum Tiy was well and truly off the scene then. But sorry, he set that up. He set the original one up in 1891. That's right. Sorry, and some Kum Tiy was still in business, but I'm certain that he himself wasn't there then. Okay, in terms of the philanthropic activities, these are varied and many, and I've just got hold of John Fitzgerald's co-edited book. So John, I know you're on the line. I'm starting to read that with interest. But here's a bucket load of newspaper articles that cite his donations to these domestic charities. Interestingly, most of them are, well, not interestingly, well, to me it was, but I suppose to others it's a no-brainer that the hospitals were the main recipients of his generosity, and other institutions that elderly Chinese or poor Chinese might require whilst they're in the colonies. So that's, I've also discovered that wasn't just Sydney. This was occurring in all of the regional locations where branch stores were located, you know, and the other interesting one besides hospitals was fire brigades. Internationally, there was the 1878 Chinese Famine Relief Fund established in Australia. There was the 1880 Irish Distress Relief Fund, and there was the 1888 Yellow River Flood Relief Fund. I'm just using those 3 as the examples, they're the big ones. But interestingly, some Kum Tiy was appointed the treasurer or co-treasurer of all those funds. So he was receiving the money and acquitting it. So again, I guess that gives some indication of his standing. In terms of representational activities, and again, most of these are associated in the literature with Kwong Tat, but when you get the actual documents and you cite who signed them, there's not just Kwong Tat, but there's a few other prominent Chinese merchants, and some Kum Tiy was a co-signator to all those ones that I've listed there. Okay. So here are some other examples. This is the 93 petition of appreciation to the from the Chinese community to the Earl of Jersey when he departed as governor. Now, I think it's his firm that signed that, not him personally. 1890 farewell address to Lord Carrington. And as I've previously shown you, the petition 2 of the 2 petitions to the Intercolonial Conference on the Chinese question that Parkes was so instrumental in bringing all the colonies together at that time in 1888. When the dynasty sent out the Chinese commissioners in 1887 for a year-long tour of the colonies in Australia, Some Kum Tiy was one of the hosts for the, there were 6 leading members of the Sydney community that hosted that visit, Some Kum Tiy being one of them. There's an interesting connection here between Brigadier General Wong Young Ho and Some Kum Tiy. It goes back to the time of the Taiping Rebellion, where it's reported that, sorry, I'll go back. It's reported that the general could speak English. I think he was born in Malacca and learned English there. But he was the translator between Chinese Gordon and the imperial provincial governor who couldn't speak English. And he knew quite well of the activities of the ever victorious army and spoke highly of them. Well, I suppose he should. He's a member of the Qing dynasty. The other interesting thing about Some Kum Tiy is contained in this New South Wales Colonial Royal Commission report on Chinese gambling and immortality, 1891-92. Some Kum Tiy gets a fair mention in this. And I thought this one was pretty interesting. This is from a guy called Kelly, who was the secretary of the Anti-Chinese Gambling League. So they were anti-Chinese. He was a grocer and a resident of George Street, so he must know what's going on. When he was asked to nominate any legitimate Chinese places of business in that locality, he cited Some Kum Tiy among the few he could remember. He further stated he could not say that gambling or opium smoking was carried out on these premises. And then Some Kum Tiy get a thumbs up from all these witnesses. And as you can see there, they're not all Chinese. There's a policeman, there's a local minister of religion, and there's, Boker, a carpenter, and a self-confessed gambler. So I guess that says something about Some Kum Tiy's standing. The end of the era came with this notice in the Sydney Morning Herald in June 1896, and it indicated that they were closing down, and he wanted to get rid of everything: office fittings, showcases, the lot, even the accommodation equipment from upstairs. So Some Kum Tiy as a business closed on the 4th of July 1896. But in that previous Royal Commission report I referred to, one of the witnesses, who was purported to be the nephew of one of the partners, whether it was Some Kum Tiy or not, I don't know, said that all the partners were back in China at that stage. And that was evidence given in 1891. So, settler or sojourner was the research question for me. So the settler indications, well, it was a very successful era of business venture, in 3 Australian colonies: Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, New Zealand, and the Pacific. He was very successful. He was a freehold landowner. He'd established national and international standings in the business community. He had significant social advancement within the Australian and Chinese diaspora. And he was obviously a respected leader of various county-based associations. He had broad recognition in the European community. And he was an accepted spokesperson for the Chinese community in terms of that seen by the colonial administrators. So one would have thought, given those achievements over the time from 1864-5 to 1895, he would have had some settler intentions, given the sort of turmoil that he left in China at the end of the Taiping Rebellion. But we know from a raft of historical publications, professional publications at that the times were changing. And why? Well, the changes that I've discovered that confronted Chinese merchants in Australian colonies at that time, first of all, there was this distinct challenge to his acquired lifestyle and business aspirations. And examples, there was more restrictive laws being introduced by the various colonial governments of that time towards the end of the 1880s, 1890s. There was a smallpox experience that I mentioned before. It must have, been it must have played heavily on his mind that his firm, his shop in particular, was, considered one of the points of outbreak of that disease at that time. There was certainly an increase in the anti-Chinese sentiment as a result of a lot of incidents in the late 1880s. There's anti-Chinese legislation being introduced by the various colonial governments. Sorry, I'll have to go back. And this was to reduce, Chinese immigration and hence part of his catchment for his businesses. And don't forget, mining was on the wane, or had been for some time. There's also a changing local environment. In 1888, New South Wales government introduced the poll tax increase to £100 per person, or one person per 300 tonnes of shipping. And that would seriously restrict the number of Chinese immigrants coming in. As I said originally, he was taking advantage of the main shipping node at Circular Quay, but that over the years and by the 1890s had moved to Haymarket and to the Balmoral markets. And they had increased in importance, so much so that most of the Chinese merchants that were staying had moved. There was a move towards federation of the Australian colonies in the 1890s. Well, it started in the late 1880s. It was a changing world, in particular a changing China and the emergence of modern business practices. So China, there's an image of its first train, which occurred in this period. And so it was going through a mini industrialization process. The Qin dynasty was seriously failing, and there was more business opportunities opening up in China. And modern business practices for the Chinese merchants staying in Western countries, they were adopting their own version of the Chinese accounting, the Western accounting systems and so on. And you'd have to ask for someone like Kum Tiy, who would have been then well into his 70s, did he want to change the way he was doing business? And then lastly, I think there might have been an intersection with tradition, because Chinese were told, and this comes from a museum down in southern China, go overseas, get rich, come back, buy land, build a house and get married. So that was the universal aspirations of the sojourners. And the merchants, making this money overseas could live certainly well back in China. There's an image of a Chinese merchant's mansion in Canton. So a brief summary to finish up here on Kum Tiy. There's his service in the EVA. There's his time of residency in Australia. So the evidence that I've got suggests he was born in the mid to late 1820s. He may have been a Christian. It's highly likely he's a native of Jiangshan County. He certainly saw service in the EVA. His first evidence in New South Wales is early 1865, and by 1890 he had returned to China. And one of his daughters, my great-grandmother, was born, well, it says on a certificate in Canton, but we know what that means, in 1852. So to conclude, history, what is it good for? Well, first of all, I would argue that my family history journeys thus far have taken me to places, events and connections to people well beyond my wildest expectations. There I was a few years ago, just focusing on far north Queensland, even though I was born and bred there. That was interesting in itself, but to spread beyond that is fascinating. My family history inquiries have situated my research in the broader, well, now situated in the broader Australian historical context of the second half of the 19th century and the early 20th century. And more recently, it's shown my research has reached into a very narrow window of the more extensive Chinese history. And then lastly, it's demonstrated that my ancestors not only lived through some of the world's major and national events, but have shaped their present day lives, but they also were active participants in those events and in some cases helped to shape their outcomes. So some of the conclusions, the Chinese Australians in the second half of the 19th century, early 20th century, in my opinion, were true pioneers of the Australia's settlement, mining and agricultural frontiers. Now, why that's important is that unlike the American experience, it wasn't the explorers that were first into these areas that no European or non-Indigenous person had gone to. It was the miners, the agriculturalists, the settlement frontier moved along that front. Not all Chinese migrants were gold miners, as I've shown. They certainly were capable of developing sophisticated business models of commerce and trade. They were extremely entrepreneurial. They were very innovative agriculturalists. They were excellently networked, both locally, nationally and internationally. They were well engaged with the political leadership of the colonies, so they weren't subdued in that sense. They were prominent advocates of their communities. They were generous philanthropists. And lastly, we are dealing here with a very diverse diaspora, both politically, socially, and economically. And they were not a homogeneous community, as many Western written histories would have us believe. So as I conclude here, I'm saying that these conclusions of mine, from only my family history, challenge the many commonly held, perpetuated, misplaced and simplistic stereotypes of Chinese Australians of this era. Personal development, well, it's helped me to better appreciate another perspective of Australian history, the one that I was taught while I was at primary school, and which has remained largely unchanged today, even for my grandchildren. And lastly, it's given me a fuller understanding of the contribution that my ancestors have made to Australia's development. So in conclusion, I would hope that my family history research will have a positive effect on our future generations, mine in particular. So thanks for listening. There's a reference to a publication that sums up some Kum Tiy as of the end of last year, with more research to come. And I'm happy to take any questions. Back to you, Michael.
Okay, thank you very much, Darryl. That was great, and I'm sure people will have many interesting questions. Particularly, take your point that your research has challenged some of the stereotypes that are still perpetuated about Chinese Australia and Chinese Australian history in general. Particularly, the idea of diversity within that community. This idea of Chinese is a really difficult one that people deal with all the time. And your ancestors certainly a very interesting example of that. Right, Kerry is saying you've got a round of applause going on here, so I'm sure that's true. But we're opening up things to chat to any questions that people may have. There's one question here from Cam Louis that's come through. He's just asking about, do you know that any of the characters for the name Some Kum Tiy? Did you ever know what his name was in Chinese?
I do now. I didn't know it when I wrote the article last year. This is a fast-moving target, but yes, I do have the characters now. Well,
Right.
sorry, at least I have the characters from the Chinese language newspapers of Australia in the early 1900s.
Right. So that's really is his name. It's not a kind of a nickname or a name that's associated maybe with his business. It's the full family name, and Sun is the name.
No. The real problem here, as most of you would know better than I, is that when I first researched this, I sort of thought, well, maybe he's a senior partner and the firm's name came from his name, because I knew Kum Tiy was my grandmother's name.
Right.
And then further research and other advice that's come to me from experts better than I is that a lot of the Chinese adopted their trading name as their family name. And I've got other, ancestors that did that.
Yes.
I mean, Lo Choi is not my real family name, and nor is my mother's family name. Ji Ki is nowhere near the family name. So you don't know whether some Kum Tiy or Kum Tiy is his real name, or he adopted that as a business name, then took the business name in Australia as his family name. I mean, there's no way to know that at this stage.
Right. And Cam, who asked the original question, was hazarding a guess that some Khan was the characters for New Gold. There's a New Gold Mountain, but that's not.
Yeah. That's right.
That is right.
Kum is gold in Cantonese,
Right.
And we do know. I don't know if Paul McGregor's on the line, but Lo Kwong Ming and both Some Kum Tiy, a lot of their branch stores, they use the word "cum" extensively.
Yeah, so it's just it could well be business related.
Yeah, that's right.
Or as you know.
Yeah.
All right. Oh, very interesting. Thanks for that. All right. So another question here. So Ann Toy's asking, would the George Street store have catered exclusively to the Chinese community, or did it also service the local population? The one you mentioned there in Upper George Street.
Yeah, good question, Anne. I haven't found any advertisements for that store at this stage, but if I read around this issue, I'm guessing that they traded not exclusively, but mainly with the Chinese compatriots. I mean, if it was a clan-based store, the information I have was 40% of Sydney at that time, the Chinese living there, were from Cheongshan. It wasn't a See-Up group or anything like that. The dominant group was Cheongshan. So that again makes sense. But I do know from other articles that Europeans came to that store socially. So who knows whether they traded economically. I can't answer that at this stage, I'm sorry.
Right, all right, fair enough. All right, so from Natalie here, there's another question. She's asking about wife and children and their history in Australia. Also what happened to some of the other branch stores after presumably some Kum Tiy return. Do you have any information about the family? Presumably have some.
Nothing on the family except my great grandmother, who was married in 1873 in Sydney. I wish I could get into the Anglican Church's archives, but that's another story. I guess none of you can either, but because I think that's where the record is that I need. And I've got heaps of evidence as to why she was, well, I know she was a Christian and she was Church of England. You know, all her children, stillborn and others who died prematurely, were buried in Anglican or Church of England as it was then, cemeteries, not Chinese cemeteries. So no, nothing really on the family, of his family. I have a lot on the family of his partner, who lived above the store. And in terms of the branch stores, I've got a lot of information about when they closed. They were all sold up by the time he would have gone back to China in 1890, 1891.
Right, right. And that was a question I was going to ask too. So you talk about branch stores and his involvement. So presumably he was always a partner in these stores, or rather than a sole owner, or that's how the operations work by and large, or did he own some and some were partners? How did you get a sense of how that was?
Yeah, okay. So got a lot of information on that, and that's going to be part of the subject of my next paper. So there were a number of models he apparently was using. One was like Young, they would go up there and set up their own branch, pay for everything, buy their own building. Well, he moved in there beforehand, but when he saw that it was a fair, there was a fair amount of interest in his store, they built a permanent building. So that was owned outright, built the building, put their own manager in. The other one, he would go in to an existing store and buy out the owners completely and take it over as their store. The third model, he'd go in and buy a share. And so he partnered with the original owner of the store. So there are a number of different models he was using from my research to date.
Right. Oh, that's very interesting. It's a very sophisticated operation he's got going there. And Kerry's asking a question then about him, perhaps, or perhaps others as well in general. When other people, do you think he returned to the home village, or do you think he returned perhaps to Hong Kong or Shanghai to where he would, with his money, or to Canton itself? Do you have any idea of where he went after he left Australia?
No, I don't. Some people have suggested to me that he probably went back to Hong Kong, because I don't know, but I'm led to believe that a lot of wealthy Chinese merchants did go back to Hong Kong. But I'm getting closer to pinning down his actual original village. I'm getting that close. So I guess once I find that out, I'll be able to answer that question.
Right. Well, he must have been quite an adventurous guy, because they say he was in Shanghai at one point. And it was fairly early days in Shanghai, and we know the Cantonese connection with Shanghai was quite strong later on, but in the 1860s, it would not necessarily have been quite so strong. So he's already decided to go up, perhaps try Hong Kong.
I don't think that was the case. No, from what I've read about the Ebb Victorious Army, they recruited Cantonese soldiers because they considered, well, this is Ward, the American who set it up, considered the Cantonese superior soldiers to other regions in China. So that they were purposely recruited from Canton.
All right, so you may have been recruited initially from there to join the army to come up for that purpose.
Yeah, that's one inference you could make from understanding the preference for regional soldiers, you know, in the EVA.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, well, that might have begun that Cantonese link with Shanghai, then it might have begun with that very recruitment.
Yeah, could have, yeah.
All right, so Christian Yates here says that the Anglican Church birth, death and marriage records are online via Ancestry. I don't know whether you've accessed that or whether that is an avenue for your research.
Yeah, well, thanks for that. I have tried that, but it's not the records I need.
All right,
that's interesting, because there was, I just can't remember his name. Anyway, there was an early Chinese ordained minister um, who lived down at the Rocks, or his parish was down at the Rocks. And I think he might have been part of this process I'm looking for, whether there was a marriage conducted down there. Anyway, I mean, some of his records are missing, apparently. And it seems logical that a Chinese ordained minister of the Church of England would have performed the marriage. I mean, it's only speculation on my part, but it seems logical. And unfortunately, his records, well, a lot from that era, are missing. That's my quest.
Right. Oh, that's always a nuisance with
Yeah.
these kind of records. So Sandy is asking a more specific question here, which I assume she thinks you will have the answer to this. So her question is, what's the connection between Qigong, Li Lai and Sam Kong On? Was Sam Kong On of George Street, Sydney, associated with Sam Kong Thai? Also, did Sam Kong Thai have a wife in Australia? So, all right, I'll leave that to you. These people.
Thank you, Sandy, for that question. The answer is I don't know. Sam Kum Tiy, I haven't found any evidence of having a wife in Australia. But when I find out, you'll be the first to know. Secondly, it's interesting that Li Lai went into partnership. I would assume that he would have gone into partnership with his father-in-law, but he didn't. Now, I'm trying to find some connections between Sam Kum Tiy and Sam Kum On, because Sandy's referring to a firm that was called Wing On, and my great-grandfather, Li Lai, was a partner in Wing On. This is the first Wing On, not the one that eventually went to Hong Kong and successful. There was an earlier Wing On, and it was at Milchester, Georgetown, Palmer River, or Maytown, and of course Cooktown. And they were getting their produce out of Sydney and out of Townsville. Now, Sam Kum Tiy had a warehouse as well as a shop in Townsville, but I haven't found any evidence of the consignment of goods directly from him to his son-in-law, who was Wing On. So, right. Sandy, I'm still researching that, mate.
Right. And Sam Kong On, is that a separate person, do you think, or that's another alias?
That firm, or him, was a partner in Wing On as well.
Right. But definitely separate from Sam Kong Tiy then.
Well, at this stage, I haven't found a link.
Well,
I'm looking for a link, but I haven't found one.
All right, now Benjamin Lee here is asking a number of questions, I'll just summarize these questions because they're similar. He's really kind of wanting to know more about how to do research, similar to what you've done, presumably. I mean, he's saying, what, apart from Trove and the National Archives, what kind of research have you been able to do? Particularly, are you able to do research in Zhongshan, for example, if you don't have a very good Chinese, or would you recommend for someone embarking on the research?
Yeah, I don't know whether I'm the right person to ask because I'm an amateur at this, but in terms of the branch stores, I tell you what, there's a bucket load of information sitting out in country town historical societies, not online, tucked away in 4-drawer filing cabinets, you know, old council records, rate records, post office records, and you've just got to go out there, visit it, you know, and spend a couple of days going through their records and then giving them, you know, a good donation for letting you have access. I mean, they're all voluntary. They're not open every day, but I find that's where I'm getting a lot of my information for the branch stores, out in the local history groups. As far as, I mean, obviously, you know, the archives have got a lot of information, places like Mitchell Library, but they're no-brainers. I've also found that I can get into some of the information in China, but I've got to be more precise in terms of geographic locations I'm looking for. I mean, a lot of the returning merchants set up family libraries. I know on my mother's side, there's a family library there in one of the villages, but they're C-up. Now, so I want to go through family libraries over there. And I guess if it wasn't COVID-19, I would be still researching in China. But I haven't been there for a couple of years now. But if things go back to some sort of normality, it's my intention on one of my real research trips back there, I'll take a sidebar trip and go down to Zhongshan and, research there, but I haven't had a chance to do that yet. The Chinese language newspapers in Australia are throwing up some information, not that much, but it gives you another perspective because you're getting a Chinese mind interpreting the events of the day rather than a Western European mind, which can be quite distorting. So, yep, that's another source of information that's useful. But yeah, I think there's no easy way through this, and everything is certainly not online.
No, that's certainly true. All right, so Darryl, I just want to, at this point, I'll say we've finished with the chat questions, and thank you very much for what you've given us so far. And if you're willing to hang on a little bit, what I'll do is I might open up the discussion to live questions and let people unmute themselves, if that's okay. Do you want to?
Yeah, that's fine by me.
Experiment. We'll see how it goes, how that goes. We've still got about 44 people online here. A few people have had to leave, but if anyone wants to stay, what I'm going to do now is change the settings so that people can unmute themselves. I'd like people to keep muted most of the time, but unmute yourself when you want to ask a question or wave a hand. If you can wave your hand. There's an icon that allows you to wave your hand and I can pinpoint you to ask a question, but we'll see how it goes with a bit of a free-for-all at the moment. So, all right. So people can unmute themselves if anyone wants to ask a question, or you can wave your hand and I think I can undo your video as well. And would anyone like to talk, to ask Darryl some questions? Oh, no, everyone's gone quiet now. I haven't figured it out. All right, here we go. Sandy, Sandy's there. There you go, Sandy. You had your go. You have another go. Oh, no, just give it up. No, yes, there you go. Okay, you got to unmute yourself, Sandy.
I'm in relaxed mode, sorry.
There you go.
Thanks, Darryl. That was a fantastic discussion, and I was thinking of so many questions I wanted to ask you. And I'm really interested in that bankrolling of Lee Lai up through the Gilberton up to Palmer, because that's the one link we've been looking for. So I think that's a further discussion. And Sun Kum Tiy was burnt down in the 1880s in Townsville. The actual building was completely gutted and burnt down.
That's right.
Yes. So and that's a little bit, about 10 years after you've got Lee Lai in the area. So I'm just interested, did that, when the store was impacted so much, did your man back away from that branch line and then concentrate on another one? Because that must have been that was a big loss.
It was, but I do know that he was insuring everything.
Yeah.
I mean, I've got one account where he paid £1,000 a year for insurance. So I don't know whether it was a financial loss or not. I assumed Townsville would have been insured. It was a big operation, and the warehouse was there.
Yeah.
He did move around the corner to the other street and rebuild.
Yeah.
So I haven't made all those connections. I just know the events at this stage, and I guess I've got to go away and try and work through my mind and the evidence what might have been going on.
So for the people that are, sorry to interrupt, for the people that are online listening, this is quite an interesting connection for me in Townsville, because that's one of the very earliest stores to set up in the history of Townsville. So he's up in the emerging settlements such as Townsville, and if we can get that link to Cooktown, when those northern port stores were first emerging. So that's really interesting that he's at the forefront of that pattern of expansion settlement. And I just wanted to make that point.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. So I've always wondered about the merchant connection, because you've got the stories of the merchants chartering ships to bring people to the gold mines initially, you know, bringing those first.
And it was, and the connecting point was Li Lai. He was the first person to charter a ship with people to North Queensland.
Right, right. So he's got delivered the workers there, and then he's setting up the business to sell them stuff. So he's doing very well.
It was typical merchant activities.
Yep.
I've also got some information where they set up the first store, obviously in a tent or a bark hut, and they'd send a trusted person with some money and some stores, you know, obviously on a dray to set up the store. It might have been, you know, a relative or someone from the same village or county that they trusted. And if that started to show a profit, they would then go in with a more permanent establishment.
A great setup.
I've got evidence of that activity.
Mm. Mm. A tester.
Yeah.
Testing the waters.
Yeah.
I'll go now. Malcolm looks like he wants to ask a question.
All right, thanks for that, Sandy. All right, Malcolm, do you want to ask a question? Have to unmute. You need to unmute. There you go.
Yes, I've unmuted. This is not actually Chinese history, or although it might be, but what is a brevet major? What's the word brevet imply?
Oh, honorary major, Michael.
Okay.
So the system in those days was you had to serve so many years at a certain rank before you're entitled to get promoted. And obviously, Gordon hadn't spent the requisite number of years as a captain to get promoted to major, but there was a system to make him an honorary major. It was called brevet major.
Okay, thanks.
Well,
the Chinese, by the way, Michael, the Chinese made him a field marshal.
Gordon. Right. Actually, that was another question that did come up. You mentioned how they were recruiting the Cantonese. I always thought it was Filipinos that were in the victorious army.
No.
Initially, you know, was that just a kind of general term? They weren't.
No.
I know they were very specific with their terms in those days.
No. The Filipinos were recruited, and if you looked at the images of Gordon, he carried no weapons into battle. He'd have a cane, a swagger stick.
Mm.
He had a personal bodyguard. They were all Filipinos. They weren't Chinese.
Right.
You could trust the Filipinos.
No, you wouldn't trust China.
So yeah, the Filipinos were recruited into the EVA, and specifically for the bodyguard of the commander.
Right, that makes sense. And the other thing I was asked about the turbans they were using. Where is that coming from?
I have no idea.
Right.
I've assumed it was modelled on the British experience in India.
Right, they just thought they'd give them something to make them distinctive, presumably on the battlefield.
Yeah, have a look at their shoes as well.
Mm. Yeah, it's very interesting history, and very interesting to have that Taiping connection, because I'm always emphasising in my history that the Taiping didn't cause people to come to Australia. That's that kind of usually stereotypes, that trope, the Taiping caused a stampede of people, even though we know the connection with down in the south was much stronger and went back further in history. And the Taiping, of course, affected areas that nothing to do with the Cantonese areas. But the fact that you've got specific connection there is an interesting one.
Well, one other connection that I'm starting to pick up just subtly in the records here is that there was some standoff between the Chinese that came here that were part of the EVA and those that were members of the Taipei Rebellion. And
yes,
some of my research in New Zealand shows that they knew which side they were on in New Zealand when they got to New Zealand.
Right.
Now, I'm not certain whether there was any animosity as a result of that, but there was comment about, you know, that so-and-so was, you know, one of the bloody rebels.
That's fascinating. Yes, well, that's great. That really puts us deep into Chinese history when we're looking at those kind of connections. And they're obvious when you start finding them, but you've really got to dig to bring them out. Okay, we haven't got any more chat questions. It doesn't look like anyone else wants to come on, unless you want to ask any more questions, Malcolm.
Oh, fine, thanks.
You're fine. All right. So, all right, how about we wrap it up there, Daryl, and say thank you very much for your talk. I'll tell everybody that we've recorded this and we'll be putting that up online in a week or so as well. For those, if you tell anyone who missed it or you want to look at it again, or feel free to send other questions through to the Chinese Australian Historical Society if you have any more interest in what Daryl's been researching. Okay, so thank you very much, and I'll say goodbye. Thank you, Daryl, and thank you, everyone.
Cheers.
Okay, bye-bye. See you later.